The morning mist clung to Port Royal's harbour like a shroud, obscuring the weathered docks where merchants and sailors conducted their grim business. Inspector Thomas Whitmore of the British Colonial Authority stood at his office window, watching the fog slowly lift to reveal the bustling port below. The year 1848 had brought unprecedented challenges to Jamaica's administration, and Whitmore found himself dealing with increasingly disturbing reports from the maritime trade. A sharp knock interrupted his contemplation. "Enter," he called, turning from the window. Sergeant Mills stepped inside, his face pale and drawn. "Sir, we've received a most peculiar report from the harbour master. The Providence has been spotted leaving port this morning." Whitmore frowned. "The Providence? That name sounds familiar." "It should, sir. According to our records, the Providence sank in a storm 3 years ago, taking Captain Elias Crow and his entire crew to the bottom of the Caribbean." The inspector's blood ran cold. He moved to his desk and pulled out a thick ledger, flipping through pages of maritime records. His finger stopped at an entry dated September 15, 1845. "Providence, total loss. Captain E. Crow, presumed dead. Vessel destroyed in hurricane off the coast of Cuba." "Are you certain it was the Providence?" Whitmore asked, though he already dreaded the answer. Mills nodded grimly. "The harbour master confirmed it, sir. Same black hull, same distinctive figurehead of a woman with outstretched arms. He said Captain Crow himself was at the helm, looking exactly as he did 3 years ago." Whitmore set down the ledger with trembling hands. Captain Elias Crow had been one of the most notorious figures in the Caribbean, a man who operated in the grey areas between legitimate trade and outright piracy. His specialty had been trafficking escaped slaves back to plantations and, more disturbingly, selling bodies to medical colleges in the American colonies for anatomical study. "Who else was aboard?" Whitmore inquired. "The usual suspects, sir. Marcus Iron-Tooth Sullivan, his first mate, Big Jim Morrison, the ship's enforcer, the Hernandez brothers, Carlos and Diego, and that quiet one, Samuel Thorne." Mills paused. "Plus a cargo of human merchandise." The inspector walked to his window again, staring out at the harbour where the Providence had supposedly departed. The fog had completely lifted now, revealing crystal clear waters and normal maritime traffic. No sign of the phantom vessel. "Sir," Mills continued hesitantly, "there's something else. The harbour master mentioned seeing an African man aboard, tall with tribal scarification on his face. He was standing near the captain, not in chains like the others." Whitmore's mind raced. In all his years dealing with Crow's operations, he had never known the captain to keep an unchained slave aboard his vessel. Crow was paranoid about rebellion, often keeping his human cargo sedated for the entire journey. "What was this man's demeanour?" Whitmore asked. "According to the harbour master, he seemed calm, almost serene. He was looking directly at the dock, as if he could see everyone watching, but there was something in his eyes that made the harbour master uncomfortable." The inspector turned back to his desk and began writing rapidly. "I want you to send word to every British naval vessel in the Caribbean. They are to be on the lookout for the Providence and report its position immediately. Do not attempt to board or engage. Simply observe and report. Sir, with respect, shouldn't we try to intercept them? If Crow is somehow alive and operating again—" "Sergeant," Whitmore interrupted, his voice heavy with foreboding, "if a ship that sank 3 years ago is sailing our waters with a dead man at its helm, I suspect we're dealing with something far beyond our normal jurisdiction. For now, we watch and we wait." As Mills left to carry out his orders, Whitmore remained at his window, staring out at the deceptively peaceful harbour. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the Providence was cutting through Caribbean waters, carrying its cargo of human misery toward an unknown destination. But what troubled the inspector most was not the impossibility of the ship's existence. It was the image of that calm, scarred African man standing freely on deck, as if he were not a prisoner at all, but something far more dangerous. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on Port Royal, but Inspector Whitmore felt a chill that seemed to penetrate his very bones. In his 20 years of colonial service, he had learned to trust his instincts, and every instinct now screamed that the Providence's departure marked the beginning of something terrible. Aboard the Providence, the stench of human suffering permeated every plank and rope. In the ship's hold, 23 souls lay chained in conditions that would have shamed the devil himself. But on the main deck, Josiah stood unshackled, his tall frame silhouetted against the endless blue of the Atlantic Ocean. Captain Elias Crow emerged from his cabin, his weathered face bearing the cruel smile that had terrorized the Caribbean for over a decade. At 45, Crow was a man who had long ago abandoned any pretense of humanity. His business was flesh, buying, selling, and disposing of human beings as if they were mere cargo. "Josiah," Crow called, his voice carrying the authority of absolute power. "Come here, boy." Josiah turned slowly, his dark eyes meeting the captain's pale blue ones without flinching. At 32 years old, he had been Crow's property for 8 years, ever since raiders had destroyed his village in what the white men called the Gold Coast. But unlike the other captives, Josiah possessed something that made him valuable beyond his physical strength. He spoke 7 languages fluently, making him an invaluable interpreter in Crow's various dealings. "Yes, Captain," Josiah replied in perfect English, his accent carrying only the faintest trace of his African origins. Crow studied him with the calculating gaze of a man who trusted no one completely. "We'll be making port in Charleston in 2 weeks. I need you to prepare the new arrivals for sail. You know what that means." Josiah nodded. His role as interpreter extended beyond language. He was expected to break the spirits of newly captured slaves, to convince them that resistance was futile and submission was their only path to survival. It was a task that had slowly eaten away at his soul, but it had also kept him alive and given him access to information that other slaves never possessed. "The cargo seems restless today," Crow continued, glancing toward the hold. "I've heard whispers, even through the language barriers. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" "Fear makes men speak in tongues they think others cannot understand," Josiah replied carefully. "They speak of home, of families they will never see again. Nothing more." First Mate Marcus Sullivan approached, his iron teeth glinting in the sunlight. Sullivan was a brute of a man, standing 6.5 feet tall with arms like tree trunks. His mouth had been fitted with iron teeth after a tavern brawl had cost him his natural ones, giving him a perpetually menacing appearance. "Captain," Sullivan growled, "the men are getting nervous. 3 days out of Port Royal, and already we're hearing strange sounds from below deck, sounds that ain't coming from our cargo." Crow's expression darkened. "What kind of sounds?" "Singing, sir. But not like any singing I've ever heard. It's in some African tongue, but it seems to be coming from the walls themselves, not from any of the slaves." Josiah felt his heart rate increase, though he maintained his composed exterior. He knew exactly what Sullivan was describing: the ancient songs of his people, the ritual chants that called upon the spirits of the ancestors for justice and vengeance. But how could the crew be hearing them when none of the current captives knew the old ways? "Josiah," Crow said sharply, "you will go below and put a stop to whatever is causing this disturbance. I don't care if you have to beat every last one of them into silence." "Of course, Captain," Josiah replied, though inwardly he recoiled at the command. As he made his way toward the hold, Josiah passed the other crew members. Big Jim Morrison, a mountain of a man who served as the ship's enforcer, was nervously checking and rechecking his weapons. The Hernandez brothers, Carlos and Diego, were whispering to each other in rapid Spanish, their eyes darting toward the hold with obvious fear. Samuel Thorne, the ship's quiet navigator, stood at the wheel with an expression of deep unease. Descending into the hold was like entering the mouth of hell itself. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, human waste and despair. 23 pairs of eyes looked up at Josiah as he entered, some with hope, others with hatred, all with the hollow look of souls pushed beyond their limits. But as Josiah moved among the chained captives, he realized something that chilled him to the bone. None of them were singing. In fact, most were too weak or traumatized to make any sound at all. Yet he could hear it clearly now, the ancient chants of his ancestors, seeming to emanate from the very wood of the ship itself. An elderly woman in the corner caught his eye. She was different from the others. Her posture was straight despite her chains, and her eyes held a clarity that spoke of inner strength rather than broken spirit. When their gazes met, she spoke in the old tongue of his village. "The ancestors have heard our cries, son of Kwame," she whispered. "The blood debt will be paid." Josiah's breath caught in his throat. No one had called him by his father's name in 8 years. No one aboard this ship should have known his true lineage. He knelt beside the woman, speaking in the same ancient dialect. "Who are you, grandmother?" "I am Asha, keeper of the old ways. I was taken from the same lands as you, but I have not forgotten who I am or what power flows in my blood." Her eyes seemed to bore into his soul. "The spirits of those who died on this ship call out for justice. They have been waiting for one who remembers the old ways to set things right." As if summoned by her words, the chanting grew louder, and Josiah could swear he saw shadows moving in the corners of the hold. Shadows that looked like human figures, but cast no reflection in the dim light. Above deck, Captain Crow paced nervously as the strange singing continued to echo through the ship. Whatever was happening in his hold, he knew it threatened everything he had built. But he had no idea that his most trusted interpreter was about to become the instrument of his destruction. The third night out of Port Royal brought with it an unnatural stillness that seemed to press against the Providence like a living thing. The usual sounds of the ocean, the creaking of rigging, the splash of waves against the hull, were muted, as if the sea itself were holding its breath. Samuel Thorne stood at the ship's wheel, his weathered hands gripping the spokes with white knuckles. As the Providence's navigator, he had sailed these waters for 15 years, but tonight felt different. The stars seemed dimmer, and the compass needle wavered uncertainly, as if the very magnetic forces of the earth were in flux. "Steady as she goes," he muttered to himself, though his voice carried little conviction. Below deck in the crew's quarters, the Hernandez brothers lay in their hammocks, unable to sleep. Carlos, the elder of the two, had been having the same nightmare for 3 consecutive nights. Dreams of drowning men reaching up from the depths of the ocean, their mouths open in silent screams. "Diego," Carlos whispered in Spanish, "are you awake?" "Sí, hermano. I cannot sleep either. Do you hear that?" Both men strained their ears. Beneath the normal sounds of the ship, there was something else, a rhythmic tapping like fingernails against wood, coming from somewhere within the walls themselves. In the captain's cabin, Elias Crow sat at his desk, reviewing the manifest of human cargo. Each name represented a significant investment, and he calculated their potential sale value with the cold precision of a man who had long ago ceased to see slaves as human beings. But his concentration was broken by a sound that made his blood run cold. Footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps, walking across the deck above his cabin. Crow grabbed his pistol and climbed the stairs to investigate. The main deck was empty, except for Thorne at the wheel. The captain approached his navigator, his weapon drawn. "Thorne, who's been walking around up here?" Samuel turned, his face pale in the moonlight. "No one, Captain. I've been alone on deck for the past 2 hours." "I heard footsteps. Clear as day, someone was walking back and forth above my cabin." Thorne's expression grew troubled. "Sir, I've heard them too, but every time I look, there's no one there. It's like someone invisible is pacing the deck." Before Crow could respond, a new sound reached their ears, the unmistakable creaking of the ship's rigging, as if someone were climbing the masts. Both men looked up to see the ropes swaying in patterns that defied the gentle night breeze. "Get Sullivan and Morrison," Crow ordered. "I want every inch of this ship searched." Within minutes, the entire crew was assembled on deck. Marcus Sullivan's iron teeth gleamed menacingly as he barked orders, while Big Jim Morrison's massive frame cast intimidating shadows in the lantern light. The Hernandez brothers emerged from below, their faces etched with fear, and even the usually composed Samuel Thorne seemed shaken. "Someone is playing games with us," Crow announced to his men. "I want to know who, and I want to know now." It was then that Josiah appeared from the direction of the hold, moving with his characteristic calm despite the chaos around him. Crow's eyes immediately fixed on him with suspicion. "Where have you been, boy?" "Tending to the cargo as you instructed, Captain. Several of the captives are showing signs of fever. I've been trying to keep them alive until we reach Charleston." Sullivan stepped forward, his iron teeth creating a grotesque smile. "Maybe our interpreter here knows more about these strange happenings than he's letting on. Africans are known for their supernatural practices." Josiah met Sullivan's gaze steadily. "I know nothing of supernatural practices, Mr. Sullivan. I am a Christian man converted by missionaries in my youth." But even as he spoke, Josiah could feel the weight of the leather pouch hidden beneath his shirt. A pouch containing items that Asha had somehow passed to him during his visits to the hold. Sacred objects from the old religion, things that should not have existed on this ship but somehow did. "Search him," Crow ordered. Big Jim Morrison stepped forward, his massive hands roughly patting down Josiah's clothing. The pouch remained hidden, protected by what Usher had called the sight that blinds the wicked. Morrison's hands passed over it multiple times without detecting its presence. "He's clean, Captain," Morrison reported. As the crew dispersed to continue their search, Josiah remained on deck, staring out at the dark ocean. The chanting from below had stopped, but he could feel something else now, a presence in the water around the ship. Dark shapes moved beneath the surface, keeping pace with the Providence but never quite breaking through to visibility. Usher's words echoed in his mind. "The spirits of those who died on this ship call out for justice." How many slaves had Crow thrown overboard during his years of trafficking? How many had died in the hold, their bodies consigned to the depths without ceremony or respect? The old woman had told him that the Providence was more than just a ship. It was a floating graveyard, soaked in the blood and tears of the innocent. And now somehow the dead were making their presence known. As the night wore on, the strange phenomena continued. Tools disappeared and reappeared in impossible locations. Ropes tied themselves into knots that no living sailor had made. And always, there was the sound of footsteps where no feet should be walking. By dawn, the crew was exhausted and on edge. Crow gathered his men once more, his face haggard from a sleepless night. "I don't care what's causing this," he declared, "but it stops now. We have a schedule to keep and cargo to deliver. Any man who spreads superstitious nonsense will answer to me personally." But even as he spoke, Crow's eyes betrayed his own growing fear. The Providence had always been his domain, his floating kingdom where his word was absolute law. Now, for the first time in his career, he felt like he was no longer in control. And in the hold below, Usher smiled as she felt the power of the ancestors growing stronger with each passing hour. The ritual had begun, and there would be no stopping it until justice was served. The fourth day brought with it a discovery that would shake the crew of the Providence to their very core. Carlos Hernandez was the first to notice it as he climbed the rigging to adjust the sails at dawn. There, painted in what appeared to be dried blood on the main sail, was a symbol that defied explanation. "Dios mío!" Carlos cried out, his voice carrying across the deck with unmistakable terror. The entire crew rushed to see what had caused the outburst. There, clearly visible against the white canvas, was an intricate tribal marking, a circle containing interwoven lines that seemed to shift and move when viewed directly, creating an optical illusion that made the eyes water and the mind reel. Captain Crow stared up at the symbol, his face pale with rage and fear. How in hell did that get there? The sail was clean yesterday. Marcus Sullivan examined the marking more closely, his iron teeth clicking nervously. "It's blood, Captain. Fresh enough to still be tacky to the touch. But there's something else." He paused, his voice dropping to a whisper. "It's warm. The blood is warm, like it just came from a living body." Big Jim Morrison stepped back from the sail, his massive frame trembling slightly. "Captain, I've seen markings like this before. In the islands, the natives use symbols like this for cursing their enemies." Crow spun around to face Josiah, who had been standing silently at the edge of the group. You know what this means, don't you?" Josiah approached the sail, studying the symbol with an expression of carefully controlled neutrality. Inside, however, his heart was racing. He recognized the mark immediately. It was the sign of Nyame, the sky god of his people, combined with symbols representing justice and retribution. It was a declaration of war against those who had spilled innocent blood. "I have seen similar markings in my homeland," Josiah admitted carefully, "but I do not know how such a thing could appear on your ship." "Don't lie to me, boy," Crow snarled, drawing his pistol. "Someone painted this symbol, and you're the only one aboard who would know its meaning." Before Josiah could respond, Samuel Thorne called out from the ship's wheel. "Captain, we have another problem." The crew rushed to the stern, where Thorne was pointing at the ship's wake. Instead of the normal white foam that should have been trailing behind the Providence, the water was stained a deep red, as if the ship were bleeding into the ocean. "What in God's name?" Crow began, but his words were cut short by a scream from below deck. The sound came from the hold, but it wasn't the voice of any of the captive slaves. It was Diego Hernandez, and his cry was filled with pure terror. The crew raced below to find Diego standing frozen in the center of the hold, staring at something that made no sense. Every single chain that had bound the 23 captives lay broken on the floor, The metal links snapped as if they were made of brittle clay. But the slaves themselves remained exactly where they had been, sitting or lying in the same positions, none of them having moved despite their newfound freedom. "The chains," Diego whispered in Spanish, "they just broke." All at once, I heard the sound like thunder, and when I looked, they were all broken. Crow pushed past his crew member to examine the scene. The chains were indeed broken, but not cut or filed. They appeared to have been snapped by some tremendous force applied from within. Yet the captives showed no signs of having struggled against their bonds. "You!" Crow pointed his weapon at an elderly man near the front. "How did you break these chains?" The man looked up with eyes that held no fear, only a deep, abiding sadness. "We did not break them, white man. They were broken for us." Asha, the old woman who had spoken to Josiah in the ancient tongue, rose slowly to her feet. Despite her age and the weeks of captivity, she moved with a dignity that commanded attention. "The ancestors grow impatient," she said in clear English, her voice carrying an authority that seemed to fill the entire hold. "Too long have the innocent suffered, too long has their blood cried out for justice." Crow aimed his pistol directly at her. "Shut your mouth, old woman, or I'll put a bullet in your head right now." "You cannot kill what is already dead," Asha replied calmly, "and you cannot escape what has already been written in the stars." As if summoned by her words, the temperature in the hold suddenly dropped by 20 degrees. The crew's breath became visible in the suddenly frigid air, and frost began to form on the metal fixtures around them. "Get everyone out of here!" Crow shouted. "Now!" As the crew fled the hold, Josiah lingered for a moment, catching Asha's eye. She nodded almost imperceptibly and pressed something into his hand. A small piece of carved bone that felt warm to the touch, despite the freezing air. "Tonight," she whispered in the old tongue, "when the moon is dark, the ritual will be complete." Back on deck, the crew huddled together as Crow paced frantically. The blood symbol on the sail seemed to pulse with its own inner light, and the red wake behind the ship had grown wider and more pronounced. "Captain," Sullivan said, his voice barely above a whisper, "maybe we should turn back, head for the nearest port and get rid of this cargo." "Absolutely not," Crow snapped. "I have buyers waiting in Charleston, and I'll be damned if I let some African superstition cost me a fortune." But even as he spoke, Crow could feel his authority slipping away. His crew was terrified, his cargo was somehow free, yet choosing to remain captive, and his ship was leaving a trail of blood in the ocean. For the first time in his career as a slaver, Captain Elias Crow was beginning to understand that there were forces in the world more powerful than his guns and his cruelty. As night fell, the Providence sailed on through increasingly troubled waters, carrying its cargo of human misery toward a destiny that none aboard could have imagined. And in the hold below, 23 freed slaves sat in silent vigil, waiting for the moment when justice would finally be served. The fifth night aboard the Providence brought with it a darkness so complete that it seemed to swallow the very stars. The moon had vanished behind thick clouds, and the ocean stretched endlessly in all directions like a black void. The only light came from the ship's lanterns, which flickered weakly, as if struggling against some unseen force. Captain Crow had ordered double watches, with armed men stationed at every critical point on the ship. But as the hours passed, an unnatural quiet settled over the Providence that made even the bravest crew members nervous. The usual sounds of the ocean had ceased entirely. No waves lapped against the hull, no wind whistled through the rigging, and even the ship's timbers had stopped their customary creaking. Marcus Sullivan stood guard near the hold, his iron teeth chattering despite the warm Caribbean air. Every few minutes he would peer down into the darkness below, where the freed slaves sat in their eerie silence. The broken chains lay scattered around them like the remnants of some ancient battle, but none of the captives had made any attempt to escape or rebel. "This ain't natural," Sullivan muttered to himself, gripping his cutlass tighter. "People don't just sit there when they could run." In the captain's cabin, Crow sat at his desk with a loaded pistol in each hand, staring at the door as if expecting it to burst open at any moment. The blood symbol on the sail above his head seemed to pulse with a rhythm that matched his racing heartbeat, and he could swear he heard whispers coming from the walls themselves. A soft knock at his door made him jump. "Who is it?" "Josiah, Captain. You asked me to report on the condition of the cargo." Crow hesitated, then called out, "Enter." Josiah stepped into the cabin, his tall frame silhouetted against the lantern light from the corridor. In the dim illumination, his tribal scars seemed more pronounced, and there was something different about his demeanor, a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. "The captives remain calm, Captain. Perhaps too calm." "What do you mean by that?" Crow demanded, not lowering his weapons. "They speak of dreams, sir. Dreams of their ancestors calling to them from beneath the waves. They say the dead are rising to claim what was stolen from them." Crow's hands trembled slightly. "Superstitious nonsense. I've dealt with rebellious slaves before." "Have you, Captain?" Josiah asked, stepping closer. "Have you ever dealt with slaves who could break iron chains without touching them? Have you ever seen blood appear on sails in the middle of the ocean? Have you ever sailed through waters that turn red with the memory of innocent blood?" "Get out," Crow whispered, but his voice lacked its usual authority. Instead of leaving, Josiah moved to the small porthole and gazed out at the dark ocean. "Do you know how many people have died on this ship, Captain? How many souls you've sent to the bottom of the sea?" "I said get out." 47, Josiah continued, as if Crow hadn't spoken. 47 men, women, and children who died in your hold and were thrown overboard like garbage. Their names are written in the wood of this ship, carved into every plank by their suffering. Crow raised both pistols, pointing them directly at Josiah's back. "I'll kill you where you stand!" Josiah turned slowly, and in the lantern light, Crow saw something that made his blood freeze. The African's eyes were no longer his own. They held the depth and wisdom of ages, as if he were looking through the eyes of every ancestor who had ever lived. "You cannot kill what has already been claimed by the dead," Josiah said, his voice carrying harmonics that seemed to come from multiple throats. "Tonight, the debt will be paid in full." Before Crow could pull the triggers, the lanterns in his cabin suddenly went out, plunging the room into absolute darkness. In the blackness, he could hear movement, not just Josiah, but others. Footsteps that made no sound, voices that whispered in languages he didn't recognize, and the rustle of clothing from people who shouldn't be there. When the lanterns flickered back to life moments later, Josiah was gone. But Crow was no longer alone in his cabin. Standing around him in a circle were figures that defied explanation. Translucent forms of men, women, and children, all bearing the marks of violence and suffering. Their eyes held the same ancient wisdom he had seen in Josiah's gaze, and their mouths moved in silent accusation. Crow tried to scream, but no sound emerged from his throat. He tried to run, but his legs wouldn't obey his commands. The ghostly figures began to close in, their hands reaching out toward him with fingers that seemed to drip with seawater and blood. On deck, the rest of the crew was experiencing their own supernatural encounters. Big Jim Morrison found himself surrounded by the spirits of children he had helped capture, their small hands tugging at his clothes as they whispered accusations in voices like the wind. The Hernandez brothers were confronted by the ghosts of families they had torn apart, mothers and fathers who reached out with arms that passed through their bodies but left them feeling colder than ice. Samuel Thorne, still at the ship's wheel, watched in horror as the ocean around the Providence began to glow with an eerie phosphorescence. Shapes moved beneath the surface, human forms swimming alongside the ship, keeping pace despite the vessel's speed. As he stared, one of the figures broke the surface, revealing the face of a young woman whose eyes held the terrible knowledge of the drowned. "Turn back," she whispered, her voice carrying clearly across the water. "Turn back before it's too late." But Thorne found that the wheel would no longer respond to his commands. The Providence continued on its course, guided now by forces beyond human control, sailing toward a destiny that had been written in blood and sealed with the tears of the innocent. In the hold below, Asha stood among the other captives, her arms raised toward the deck above. The carved bone that she had given to Josiah now glowed with its own inner light, and the ancient words of power flowed from her lips like a river of justice finally finding its course. The ritual had begun, and there would be no stopping it until every debt was paid and every wrong was made right. The Providence sailed on through the supernatural storm, carrying its cargo of the living and the dead toward a reckoning that had been 8 years in the making. The sixth night brought with it a stillness so profound that it seemed as if the very ocean had stopped breathing. The Providence drifted motionless on waters that reflected no light, creating the illusion that the ship was suspended in an endless void. The supernatural events of the previous days had reached a crescendo, and now the moment of ultimate justice had arrived. In the hold, Asher stood at the center of a circle formed by the 23 freed captives. The broken chains around them had begun to glow with the same phosphorescent light that emanated from the ocean, and the air itself seemed to thrum with ancient power. The carved bone that Josiah carried pulsed in rhythm with his heartbeat, growing warmer with each passing moment. "The time has come," Asher announced in the old tongue, her voice carrying to every corner of the ship, despite being spoken in barely more than a whisper. "The ancestors have gathered, and the debt of blood must be paid." Above deck, the crew of the Providence found themselves unable to move, as if invisible chains had replaced the broken iron ones below. Captain Crow stood frozen at the center of the main deck, his eyes wide with terror as he watched Josiah emerge from the hold, carrying items that should not have existed on his ship. Ceremonial knives carved from bone, vessels made from materials he couldn't identify, and symbols painted in substances that glowed with their own inner light. What are you doing?" Crow managed to whisper, though his voice seemed to come from very far away. Josiah moved with the fluid grace of a man possessed by purpose greater than himself. As he walked, the ghostly figures of the 47 souls who had died aboard the Providence materialized around him, their forms becoming more solid with each step he took. "I am returning to the ocean what was stolen from it," Josiah replied, his voice now carrying the harmonics of multiple speakers. "For 8 years, I have served you, Captain. I have translated your words, broken the spirits of my people, and helped you profit from human misery. But tonight, I reclaim my true purpose." Marcus Sullivan tried to speak, to move, to draw his weapon, but found himself as immobilized as a statue. His iron teeth, which had terrorized so many victims, now felt like lead weights in his mouth. Beside him, Big Jim Morrison's massive frame trembled with the effort of trying to break free from whatever force held him, but his strength was useless against the supernatural bonds that constrained him. The Hernandez brothers stood side by side, their eyes reflecting the growing phosphorescent light as they watched Josiah begin to arrange his ceremonial implements in a pattern that hurt to look at directly. Samuel Thorne remained at the ship's wheel, though the Providence no longer needed a navigator. It was being guided now by currents that existed in realms beyond the physical world. "In my homeland," Josiah continued, his movements becoming more ritualistic as he spoke, "there is an ancient law. Those who steal the children of the earth, who profit from the suffering of the innocent, who treat human beings as mere cargo, they must pay the price in their own flesh." He held up one of the bone knives, its edge gleaming with an otherworldly sharpness. "The ancestors demand that the source of your power be taken from you, just as you took the power of choice from so many others." Crow's eyes widened in understanding and horror. "No, you can't. I'll give you anything. Money, freedom, your own ship. There is nothing you can offer that would satisfy the debt you owe," Josiah replied. 47 souls cry out for justice. Hundreds more who suffered in your hold demand retribution. Tonight, their voices will be heard." The ghostly figures began to move in a slow circle around the frozen crew members, their mouths open in a silent chant that seemed to vibrate through the very planks of the ship. As they moved, the phosphorescent glow grew brighter, and the ocean around the Providence began to churn with supernatural energy. Asher's voice rose from the hold, speaking words in the ancient tongue that had not been heard on Earth for centuries. The ritual she performed was older than written history, a ceremony of justice that called upon powers that existed before the first ships ever sailed these waters. One by one, Josiah approached each crew member, beginning with the captain. The bone knife in his hand seemed to move of its own accord, guided by forces beyond human understanding. What followed was not mere violence, but a cosmic balancing of scales that had been weighted with innocent blood for far too long. Captain Elias Crow, who had built his fortune on the suffering of others, was the first to pay the price. As the ceremonial blade did its work, his screams echoed across the motionless ocean, but no sound reached beyond the supernatural boundary that surrounded the Providence. The ghostly figures of his victims watched with expressions of grim satisfaction as justice was finally served. Marcus Sullivan followed, his iron teeth providing no protection against the ancient power that flowed through Josiah's hands. Big Jim Morrison's massive strength meant nothing when faced with forces that transcended the physical world. The Hernandez brothers met their fate together, as they had lived and committed their crimes together. Samuel Thorne, The navigator who had guided the Providence through so many voyages of human misery was the last to face the ritual blade. As Josiah approached him, Thorne found his voice long enough to whisper, "Why? Why are you doing this?" "Because," Josiah replied, his eyes now glowing with the same phosphorescent light that surrounded the ship. "Some debts can only be paid in blood, and some justice can only be served by those who have suffered the greatest injustice." As the ritual reached its climax, the ocean around the Providence began to glow brighter, and the ghostly figures of the dead started to fade, their need for vengeance finally satisfied. The ship itself seemed to sigh, as if a great weight had been lifted from its timbers. In the hold below, the 23 captives began to sing, not the mournful songs of slavery, but the triumphant chants of a people who had seen justice done. Their voices rose through the night air, carrying across the supernatural waters to shores that existed beyond the reach of mortal maps. The Providence sailed on through the glowing ocean, no longer a vessel of human misery, but a ship of the redeemed, carrying its cargo of freed souls toward a destiny that transcended the boundaries between life and death. 3 months after the Providence had vanished into the supernatural mists of the Caribbean, Inspector Thomas Whitmore received a report that would haunt him for the rest of his days. A British naval patrol had spotted a familiar vessel drifting off the coast of Jamaica, and what they found aboard defied every law of nature and reason. Lieutenant James Crawford of HMS Intrepid stood on the deck of the Providence, his face pale with shock as he surveyed the scene before him. The ship was exactly as it had been described in the maritime records, down to the last detail of its rigging and the distinctive figurehead of a woman with outstretched arms. But according to those same records, this vessel had been destroyed in a hurricane 3 years earlier. "Sir," Sergeant Mills called from the ship's hold, his voice trembling with barely controlled horror, "you need to see this." Crawford descended into the hold, where he found 23 sets of broken chains scattered across the floor. But there were no captives, no signs of struggle, and no indication of how the chains had been broken. The metal links appeared to have been snapped by some tremendous force, yet the hold itself showed no damage. "Where are the slaves that were reported to be aboard?" Crawford asked. "That's just it, sir," Mills replied. "There's no sign that anyone was ever held here. No waste, no personal effects, nothing. It's as if they simply vanished." On the main deck, the investigation continued to yield impossible results. The crew's quarters contained the personal effects of 6 men: Captain Elias Crow, Marcus Sullivan, Big Jim Morrison, Carlos and Diego Hernandez, and Samuel Thorne, but the men themselves were nowhere to be found. What the naval officers did discover, however, were 6 sets of clothing arranged in neat piles on the deck, each containing what appeared to be organic matter that defied identification. The ship's surgeon, Dr. William Hayes, examined the remains with growing bewilderment. "Lieutenant," Dr. Hayes reported, "these appear to be, well, they're the severed genitalia of 6 adult males, but the preservation is impossible. They should have decomposed weeks ago in this climate, yet they appear to have been removed recently." Crawford felt his stomach turn. "Are you saying someone castrated the entire crew?" "That's what the evidence suggests, sir. But there's something else." Dr. Hayes pointed to a symbol painted in what appeared to be blood on the main sail. "This marking, I've seen similar designs in my studies of African tribal customs. It's a symbol of justice and retribution." As the investigation continued, more impossible details emerged. The ship's log ended abruptly on the day it had supposedly left Port Royal, with no entries documenting the voyage or the fate of those aboard. The cargo hold contained no evidence of the human trafficking operation that had been reported, yet the ship's manifest clearly listed 23 captives. Most disturbing of all was the discovery in the captain's cabin. There, sitting calmly at Crow's desk, was a single man, tall African with tribal scarification on his face and an expression of serene composure that seemed utterly out of place given the circumstances. "Who are you?" Crawford demanded, his hand resting on his sidearm. The man looked up with eyes that held depths of wisdom and suffering that seemed to span centuries. "My name is Josiah," he replied in perfect English. "I was a slave aboard this vessel. Where is the crew? Where are Captain Crow and his men?" Josiah gestured toward the piles of clothing on the deck. "They have paid the price for their crimes, Lieutenant. The ancestors demanded justice, and justice has been served." Crawford stared at the man in disbelief. "Are you telling me that you killed 6 armed men by yourself?" "I did not kill them," Josiah replied calmly. I simply returned to the ocean what they had stolen from it. Their bodies now rest with the 47 souls they sent to the depths during their years of trafficking human cargo. That's impossible. One man cannot overpower 6 armed sailors. Josiah smiled, and for a moment, Crawford could swear he saw other faces superimposed over the Africans' features. The faces of men, women, and children who had suffered and died aboard this very ship. You think in terms of the possible and impossible, Lieutenant, but there are forces in this world that transcend such limitations. The dead do not rest easy when their blood cries out for justice. Dr. Hayes approached with his preliminary report. Lieutenant, I've examined the entire ship. There's no evidence of violence beyond what we found on deck. No blood, no signs of struggle, no indication of how 6 grown men could have been overpowered and mutilated. Crawford turned back to Josiah. How do you explain that? The ritual was performed according to the old ways, Josiah explained. Those who profit from the suffering of others must pay with the source of their power. In taking their manhood, I took their ability to dominate and control. It is an ancient justice, older than your laws and more final than your courts. You're under arrest for murder, Crawford declared, though his voice lacked conviction. Josiah stood slowly, his movements graceful and unhurried. You may arrest this body, Lieutenant, but you cannot arrest the justice that has been served. The Providence will sail no more voyages of human misery. The dead have been avenged, and the living have been freed. As the naval officers prepared to take Josiah into custody, something extraordinary happened. The ocean around the Providence began to glow with the same phosphorescent light that had surrounded it during the supernatural events of the previous months. Ghostly figures rose from the depths, the spirits of the 47 souls who had died aboard the ship, along with the 23 captives who had been freed. They stood on the water's surface, their forms becoming more solid with each passing moment, and they began to sing. The song was in an ancient African dialect, but its meaning was clear to everyone who heard it. It was a song of freedom, of justice served, and of souls finally at peace. As the song reached its crescendo, the ghostly figures began to fade, but not before each one turned to look at Josiah with expressions of profound gratitude. The last to disappear was an elderly African woman who raised her hand in a gesture of blessing before vanishing into the morning light. When the supernatural display ended, the naval officers found themselves alone on the Providence. Josiah had vanished as completely as if he had never existed, leaving behind only the impossible evidence of what had transpired aboard the ship. Lieutenant Crawford filed his report with the colonial authorities, but he knew that no one would believe the full truth of what he had witnessed. The official record would state that the Providence had been found abandoned at sea, its crew missing under mysterious circumstances. The 23 slaves who had been reported aboard were listed as fate unknown, but Inspector Whitmore, reading the report in his office in Port Royal, understood the deeper truth. He had spent his career dealing with the horrors of the slave trade, and he knew that sometimes justice came from sources beyond human law. The Providence would never again carry human cargo, and Captain Elias Crow would never again profit from human suffering. As for Josiah, some say he returned to Africa, carrying with him the satisfaction of justice served. Others believe he remains in the Caribbean, watching over the waters where so many of his people suffered and died. But all who know the story agree on one thing. The Providence and its crew got exactly what they deserved, and the ancestors finally had their revenge. The ship itself was eventually scuttled by the Royal Navy, sent to the bottom of the Caribbean, where it joined the countless other vessels that had carried human cargo across the Atlantic. But on certain nights, when the moon is dark and the ocean is still, sailors report seeing a ghostly ship sailing the waters off Jamaica, not the Providence of Captain Crow, but a vessel of the redeemed, carrying the spirits of the freed toward shores that exist beyond the reach of mortal maps. And in the depths of the ocean, where the bones of the Providence now rest, the spirits of 47 souls sleep peacefully at last, their long wait for justice finally at an end.